Hello, good evening everybody, and welcome to this very special Book Club live event. It is my enormous pleasure and privilege to be here to introduce Sir Max Hastings. Sir Max has spent a lifetime chronicling human conflict. He has reported from more wars as a young journalist than most of us have had hot dinners, starting with Vietnam. And he moved on to experience even greater depths of conflict and human depravity as an editor of the Daily Telegraph and subsequently the Evening Standard. He's since gone on to forge an absolutely unrivaled career as a military historian. He has dozens of books to his credit, and his new one, perfectly timed for the anniversary of VE Day, is this gripping book, which we're here to talk about today, Sword, D-Day, Trial by Battle, which critics have not but should have described as the ultimate beach read. And if you have purchased a ticket with the book, it's available to collect after the event, I should say, so a bit of housekeeping. And if you haven't but wish to buy the book, there are a limited number of signed copies available to buy, and Sir Max has very kindly said he's going to be able to personalise them for you if you would like him to. Now the format, Sir Max, I'm about to welcome to the stage. He's going to talk a little bit about his book, then we're going to do some Q&A, and after that there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. So now it leaves to me only to say, please welcome to the stage with a thunderous round of applause, a fusillade of applause, please, Sir Max Hastings.
Good evening, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you tonight to talk about events 80 years ago, 81 years ago to be exact. In Normandy, late on the morning of the 6th of June 1944, a British commando found himself face to face with a wounded prisoner whom he'd just shot in the stomach. The enemy was a 15-year-old from Graz in Austria who screamed in his agony. And the commando, who was himself not that much older, asked his unit interpreter the German word for sorry. He then kept repeating to the prisoner, Verzeihung, Verzeihung. He asked the interpreter to explain to his victim that he'd never shot anybody before. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, bloodiest struggle in human history. I've spent much of my life studying conflict. An implicit theme of the books which I write today is the case for us to sustain commemoration, even in 2025, to continue to look back at what we can learn from the experiences and sacrifices of that generation, now almost all in their graves. In times gone by, I published a succession of widescreen views of the 20th century's wars. Nowadays, however, my tool of choice is a microscope to explore in detail what happened to relatively small numbers of participants in what almost always proved to have been the most extraordinary phase of their lives. I'm now not much interested in generals. Instead, I focus on little people and what it was like to do the sort of extraordinary things that ordinary soldiers are called upon to do, prominent among which is to kill people. Some things spark my interest which don't catch the attention of many historians. For instance, the impact of battle on men's bodily functions. There's no reason to imagine that these operated differently among invaders landing in Normandy from those recorded by Americans landing in the Pacific, who found that in conditions of extreme fear, 1 man in 5 lost control of his bowels and 1 in 10 urinated in his trousers. Neither a great help to morale in the hours that followed their 6th of June scramble onto the sand. Let me give you another example of the sort of things that grip me, which is peculiar to sword. In one action, inland from the beaches, an infantry battalion took more than 7 hours to capture a German strongpoint which was delaying the entire division's advance. Yet in the end, that unit lost only 7 killed. What caught my eye was the fact that almost all of those were officers and NCOs, and this told an old cynic like me that the battalion's leaders paid a heavy price for showing the way, while not many of their men were willing to follow. That happens much more often than most history books record. In battle, a gallant leader leaps to his feet and shouts, "Come on, chaps!" and goes on to do or die, but often finds himself almost alone. I quote in my book the experience of a commando wounded on sword, who days later found himself in an English hospital beside a colonel who told him that his grandfather and father had commanded the same battalion as himself. On its first day in action in Normandy, he found that his soldiers wouldn't follow him into an attack, and he himself had been shot. The commando who recounted this concluded, "He didn't seem to be very badly wounded, but one morning I woke to find that he died in the night. I think he died of shame." My book is partly the story of a baptism of fire, of how 35,000 men, few of whom had ever before heard a shot fired in anger, landed on Sword Beach and with the adjoining 6th Airborne Division. But though I use this fragment of D-Day as a peg, my wider purpose is to show what it was like to be a wartime British soldier, most of whom spent only a tiny portion of their service on battlefields. Before we, or those men, hear the sounds and view the spectacle of the invaders' collision with Hitler's Atlantic War, I try to explain something of their lives and thoughts during the long years before battle was joined. Try to imagine what their experience was like compared with our own incredibly privileged existences. Privileged because we have constant choices, freedom, such as millions of wartime soldiers were denied throughout their precious youths, captives in uniform. Between Dunkirk in 1940 and D-Day in 1944, most of the army wasn't seeking glory in the desert or fighting the Japanese in Burma. Its units instead lingered training in England, unimaginably bored. They knew that the world around them was in flames, but day upon day and month after month, clad in itchy serge battle dress, they themselves endured kit inspections, route marches, weapon training, leavened only by more food than was conceded to civilians, and by the occasional moderate bliss of a weekend leave. There was a rueful joke during the Luftwaffe Blitz on the cities that most of Britain's soldiers were employed knitting socks for the civilians in the trenches. At first, they formed a garrison, deployed to defend against threatened invasion. One officer cherished the memory of a visit to his unit by the Prime Minister in the summer of 1940. Churchill stuck a mischievous thumb in the wet concrete of one of their new pillboxes, inscribing his initials, WSC. Later in those dark days, Britain's leader delivered one of his finest BBC broadcasts to the people of occupied France. "Good night, then," said Churchill, bidding farewell to his wireless audience across the channel. "Sleep to gather strength for the morning will come. Brightly will it shine on the brave and true, and kindly on all who suffer for the cause, and gloriously upon the tombs of heroes. Thus shall shine the dawn. Yet almost 4 apparently interminable years passed before Churchill's great vision of liberation began to be fulfilled. The poet Keith Douglas, a youthful army recruit, was equivocal in his own mingled apprehension and curiosity. During training, he sent some lines to a woman friend. And when I prepare to die behind my gun, I shall not glow with fervour like a sun. Then whatever will restrain the coward reasoning closely in my brain, I think it will be that I am mad to see the whole performance and what the end will be. This last ambition for personal survival represented a privilege for which all wartime humankind yearned. Though the likes of Douglas had donned battle dress, their distant vision wasn't of winning glory, but instead of completing an unwelcome duty so they could return to their real lives in offices and factories, homes and schools, on beaches where they might build sandcastles with the children they dreamed of fathering. This was an outcome which more than a few would be denied, including Keith Douglas. It's hard to overstate the frustration suffered by the majority of British soldiers who saw no battlefields during those years between the army's expulsion from France and return to it. They'd been plucked from mostly humdrum, but at least sheltered lives, jobs, families, to experience season after season of sun, rain, snow, mud, in hutted camps or in wasteland training areas, often in the company of men with whom they had little sympathy, rehearsing the skills of battle, yet denied the chance to practice them. Tobruk and Alamein, Stalingrad and Kursk, Sicily and Salerno came and went, yet in England, men repeated the same routines, fatigues, exercises, drills. A rueful 1941 officer in Evelyn Waugh's contemporary fictional portrait said, "War seems to be mostly hanging around." Wartime armies are fundamentally uncivilized. Training, wrote one such victim, was designed to transform silly, sloppy civilians into soldiers. It wasn't done by kindness either. We were marched and yelled at up and down the barrack square. We were cursed, humiliated, degraded, and worked till we were fit to drop. At the end of each day, we were allowed to relax by sitting beside our beds, polishing and burnishing a bewildering array of equipment. The armed forces communicated in a strange language of acronyms, which spilled over into civilian Britain. Tommy Handley's vastly popular BBC radio show was called ITMAR, It's That Man Again. A generation, including King George VI, learnt to laugh at his injunction, NCTW WASBE, never clean the window with a soft-boiled egg. They bid farewell to each other with one of the show's catchphrases, TTFN, ta-ta for now. A soldier wrote of how army life made him feel a lesser creature, to thrive on a few encouraging words from an unthinking oaf in authority, to delight in a cup of bad tea and a cigarette snatched between parades, to laugh inordinately at clumsy humour, or to be moved almost to tears by another's misfortunes. These were not the natural preoccupations of a mature and fairly experienced mind, yet in all those years they were mine. The novelist Anthony Powell, who served as an elderly subaltern, wrote of that terrible recurrent army dejection, the sensation that no one cares a halfpenny whether you live or die. There was an enduring popular myth that mess tea and cocoa were laced with something which curbed soldiers' interest in sex. Len Waller decided this must be true after spending a week's leave at home. His wife said that she'd been, quote, very disappointed in my prowess as a lover. Most garrison soldiers yearned for useful activity. Major John Howard, who on D-Day would undertake one of the invaders' most dramatic roles by leading his glider-borne company to seize what became Pegasus Bridge, struggled for years beforehand to assuage his men's boredom, indeed depression. They were once sent for 2 months cliff climbing in Devonshire and then ordered to march 130 miles back to their barracks, simply to wear them out. Who could be surprised by the desertions, collapses of morale, even suicides? By 1944, some people who should have known better were losing patience as they awaited the titanic clash in France, which after apparently interminable delay was now finally approaching. On the 4th of March, the Archbishop of Canterbury wrote testily to the King's private secretary, Tommy Lascelles, urging that the generals should hurry up and choose a date. The Primate was concerned that D-Day might clash with Easter or Palm Sunday, and he wished to arrange a day of prayer before the invasion. Lascelles observed dryly, he is in some ways most curiously out of touch with realities. Many men of the armies nonetheless shared the Archbishop's eagerness. D-Day was not, as our parents and grandparents' generations of British, Canadian, and American people fondly believed, the decisive event of World War II. But it was the preeminent landmark of Britain's struggle, representing the moment of rehabilitation after all the defeats and humiliations which Churchill's nation had suffered since 1940. In mid-May, Major George Appleton, who was to command a beach group on Sword, enjoyed a luxurious last leave in France. He stayed at the Savoy, dined off lobster at the Écu de France, and saw some shows. Perhaps he knew the lines of Robert Browning, I shut my eyes and turn them on my heart. As a man calls for wine before he fights, I asked one draft of earlier, happier sights, ere fitly I could hope to play my part. Think first, fight afterwards, the soldier's art. On the night of the 5th of June 1944, at Harwell Airfield in Berkshire, as Paras and glider troops embarked, BBC correspondent Chester Wilmot quizzed some pathfinders about their earlier lives. One had been a hod carrier on building sites, another a Kent toolmaker. There were also an Edinburgh bricklayer, a Worcestershire foxhunt kennelman, a Dumfries lorry driver. There were 2 pre-war regular soldiers, a deserter from the Irish Army, an Austrian Jewish refugee. They were led by a young lieutenant who had performed in the chorus line of a West End musical comedy. Many of those who landed from the air were delivered to the battlefield by glider. In our own morbidly risk-averse era, we should feel a sense of awe that thousands entrusted their lives to these craft constructed of plywood and canvas, frail as gigantic child's toys. It defied probability that hundreds of such weird artifacts, unique to that brief season as tools of war, completed passages to France and offloaded cargoes of men and guns. An officer wrote of arriving in Normandy by glider, the landing was ghastly. Mine was the first plane down, though we weren't quite in the right place, and the damn thing bucketed across the very upsy-downsy field and then broke across the middle. When many men came under fire for the first time, they stopped and went to ground. Some quickly rose again and pressed on, but others reported themselves as pinned down while they awaited support from tanks or artillery, or merely hung cover until they could be induced by their officers to move again. Sir Alan Brooke, head of the army, wrote irascibly to a fellow general, "We are not anything like as tough as we were in the last war. There has been far too much luxury, safety first, red triangle, etc. in this country. Our one idea is to look after our comforts and avoid being hurt." In June 1944, the Army's commander and Britain's Prime Minister remained, after so many earlier defeats, fearful that their soldiers were still no match for Hitler's. The most rewarding way to view the 6th of June in Normandy isn't as a huge canvas, but instead as a succession of miniature dramas performed in adjoining theatres. They were, of course, connected, but in the minds of their participants, each was a very private epic in which men were conscious only of their mates to right and left. Contrary to Brooke's ruderies, however, it never ceases to amaze me that men were successfully conditioned to perform attacks which were highly likely to get them killed. Think of the assault on the Merville battery, performed by 9 Para, who dropped into Normandy in the most chaotic landings of the night, which caused some men to land up 20 miles from their objective. I once took part in a battalion night parachute drop in Cyprus, which was a shambles. And I remember thinking back in 1963 that if this is what happened when there wasn't even an enemy, it was easy to imagine how much worse it must have been in 1944. 29-year-old Colonel Terence Otway was obliged to lead the storming of the Merville with just 1/5 of his men and none of their heavy weapons and equipment. One of his officers had to probe a path through the German minefield with his bare hands. The attackers lost about half their strength getting to the guns, which then turned out to be much smaller and less dangerous to the beach landings than the planners had feared. And the worst part was that once the survivors were in the battery, they lacked engineers and explosives with which to destroy it. Like so many acts of courage in all wars, this one wasted lives, though that should not diminish our admiration for the men who carried it out. Otway wrote to his wife Stella a few days later, lamenting the deaths of so many officers whom she'd met. Peters, that tall chap who came into the Chequers at Newbury with his wife. Tom Halliburton, the little Scotsman who helped you decorate the Christmas tree. Mike Dowling, that ugly-looking but pleasant-faced Irishman from the Ulster Rifles. Some of the 400 men who were missing when 9 Para charged the Merville rejoined later, but many did not. And now let's see some of the sights that were seen by the men who landed on Sword from the sea, filmed by Army cameramen on the 6th of June, 1944. 2 battalions, which landed first from the sea on Sword, were warned that they might suffer 50% casualties. Some companies made it almost unscathed, but others were terribly mauled. The South Lancs lost their colonel and 3 out of 4 company commanders in the first 3 minutes. Some men dashed onwards from the beach to the German strong points beyond them, but others obeyed that suicidal human instinct and burrowed into the sand or even into the water. They paid the price through the hours that followed amid German shelling and mortaring. Think what it took to push on when you saw men falling all around you. Keith Wakelam, a 22-year-old Commando signaller, had volunteered to go ashore with a spearhead in a mood of despair, prompted by consciousness that his marriage was a failure. I had expected too much of Beryl. She was a fun-loving party-goer, and I was serious, jealous, and demanding. Terry Skelly was celebrating his 20th birthday on the 6th of June. He wrote, "I was just starting down the port ramp when our craft gave a lurch as it was severely hit, depositing me in 5 feet of water. I was rolled over and over underwater until I came to rest against the body of a man jammed against a beach obstacle. I could clearly see his dead face with his eyes open and read his East York's titles. I pulled myself to my feet and started for the beach with water up to my chest. I was amazed to see a lot of soldiers huddled at the top of the beach, apparently stopped by 1 strand of barbed wire. The assault brigade was paying a terrible price for not getting off quickly enough." Signaller Norman Barker's first impression of Sword was the indescribable noise. It was all incredible and fascinating, and my main feeling was curiosity and amazement, surrounded by hundreds of ships and people and things. I wasn't frightened, rather foolishly the opposite. Tolstoy's Pierre Bezukhov had experienced the same sensation at Borodino, and Keith Douglas in the desert, that in a man's first action, curiosity could be as powerful a driver as fear. Douglas wrote, "I was like a child in a factory. A child sees the brightness and efficiency of steel machines and endless belts slapping round and round without caring or knowing what it's all there for. Later, when a soldier better understood the significance of the deadly threats around him, all that changed. Fascination was supplanted by an educated apprehension, sometimes raw terror." One of the most famous figures to land on Sword was 32-year-old Brigadier Lord Lovat, accompanied by his personal piper and 4 commando units. He was a supreme example of a vanishing species, the warrior toff. The chief of Clan Fraser, a pre-war Scots Guards officer, was distinguished by unshakable courage, film-star looks, and an arrogance that would have won the respect of Lord Cardigan of the Light Brigade. In his memoirs, Lovat writes with withering contempt of almost all those with whom he served, except his own followers, whom he adored. And they, strangely enough, in a Britain on the cusp of socialism, adored him. Harry Drew, who landed expecting the worst, touched his brigadier's belt on the beach, so that if he was killed, at least they could say that Private Drew died fighting alongside Lord Lovat. Between June 1944 and May 1945, a foot soldier who'd landed on D-Day was more likely to be hit than not, and faced a 1 in 10 chance of dying, rising to 1 in 4 if he was an officer. Many became so convinced that death must be their fate that they learned to welcome mere injury, especially a coveted blighty one, severe enough to justify a passage home, but not threatening life or limb. A major who tried to reassure a man sobbing after suffering a slight wound was quickly disabused of the illusion that the victim was unhappy. "It's the relief, sir, it's the relief." Once the German coastal defences were penetrated, reinforcement units passed through the spearhead battalions on a drive inland that Montgomery demanded should reach the city of Caen before nightfall. Several of the German strongpoints in their path collapsed and surrendered after offering minimal resistance, but at one, codenamed Hillman, the 1st Suffolks lingered for 7 hours from their first attack to a successful breakthrough. Everything took too long. At the outset, officers crawled forward to reconnoiter. Then they waited for an artillery barrage, and then they led the way forward under machine gun fire from Hillman. One of its German defenders, who watched them through a periscope, later testified, "They were advancing very slowly, very cautiously. One advances, stops, waits. Another advances. They seemed extremely cautious, looking everywhere before moving forwards as much as a meter." 3 officers and 2 NCOs were shot down as they tried to break through the Hillman wire, trenches and minefields. There were long delays after each mishap as runners were sent to the rear, engineers were summoned, new artillery barrages were arranged, tanks were called in, one of whose drivers suddenly stopped because he refused to go on because there was a dead British soldier in his path. Hour after hour, other battalions lingered in the nearby village of Colville, waiting for Hillman to be cleared. A bitter Suffolk's officer said later, "Everybody cursed us, saying, 'Why the hell don't you get on with it?' My CO had a lot of hard things said about him." In truth, the Suffolks were indeed very slow, as their few casualties attest. There was a striking contrast between the performance of 9 Para, which had stormed the Merville battery 12 hours earlier, and the showing of the Suffolks. It's very unlikely that, as the great Australian war correspondent Chester Wilmot claimed, their dallying prevented the British from getting to Caen on D-Day. That achievement was never plausible. But what happened at Hillman showed what could go wrong on any real-life battlefield for a unit whose men recoiled from the sort of sacrifices that would have been necessary to storm Hillman quickly. Wilmot, who became an authoritative post-war historian of the campaign, wrote of, quote, "the gravest shortcoming of the British Army, the reluctance of commanders at all levels to call on their troops to press on regardless of losses, even in operations that were likely to shorten the war and thus save casualties in the long run." Ronald Lewin, a distinguished historian who served as a gunner in North Africa and Normandy, wrote likewise, "It was pretty clear that the standard of training of our troops sometimes fell far short. Without the massive support of artillery and armour, our infantry were too often disposed to be sluggish and unambitious." Yet even as Hillman was still holding out against the Suffolks, a mile or two away another British regiment was giving a textbook lesson in how to fight a tank battle. Montgomery has brought back from the Mediterranean some experienced units to stiffen the novices on D-Day. Among these was the Staffordshire Yeomanry, a county territorial regiment which had originally sailed to the Middle East in 1940 with its beloved horses, and 4 years later still referred to its unbeloved tanks as mounts, crews as jockeys. Many of its officers were country gentlemen and fox hunters, some of the men tenants on local estates. Yet even if they'd been amateur soldiers when they went to war, by 1944 they were immensely battle savvy, not least their colonel, Jim Eadie, old for his role at 44, who until he donned uniform had run a brewery. Eadie wrote to his adored wife, Nadita, apologizing for having broken down and cried at what he'd known was their last meeting before setting forth for Normandy. "I was so ashamed of myself when we parted. Thank God you have courage enough for the two of us. It's far worse to be left behind, and I so truly realize that you can control yourself when I cannot. I don't really think I lack courage. It's just some wave of feeling that quite overcomes me for the moment. You were right that this time it won't be for 4 years, but I have so much better a realization of what the battlefield means. The ignorant are usually better than the experienced ones. In the late afternoon of the 6th of June, 60 tanks of 21 Panzer Division delivered the only major German armoured thrust of D-Day. Edie had told Nadita before embarking, "There's no flush of excitement within me, such as one gets at one's first battle, just a steady resolve to do my best as long as my strength shall last. I know experience counts, and I hope mine can stand others in good stead." It did. Edie's Staffordshires punished the attacking panzers brutally. 3 times the Germans sought to drive forward into the western flank of the Sword beachhead, and 3 times their tanks were hammered, until at last their commanders recognized that they were beaten and retreated to the ridge above Caen from which they'd started. Edie wrote to his wife, "In the end it wasn't as bad as I'd pictured, and we had a really good shootout with the Hun and completely scored off him." The third battle that I examine in detail in this book is that of the 2nd KSLI, the Shropshires, on the road to Caen through the afternoon and the evening. In this, their first battle, an impressive number of British officers showed themselves willing and even eager to set an example. The company commander said of those first invasion days, "There was a desire to seek glory. There was a doctrine of getting on, taking risks, staking a claim. There was a real determination to succeed or die in the attempt. The atmosphere was heroic." The leading companies of the Shropshires marched doggedly south across country towards the tall industrial chimneys clearly visible as they ascended the summits of switchback hills before descending into shallow valleys, most of them wooded and thus potentially threatening. The men of the point sections knew that there was nothing save deceptively idyllic fields, woods, and golden farmhouses between themselves and the German army, which was hastening to meet them. At every step, apparent tranquility might be shattered by enemy fire. The battalion fought a succession of actions against German troops who knew they couldn't hope to stop the British, but instead merely sought to delay them. And in the words of a Shropshire's officer, "Delay us they did. The civilians refused to evacuate themselves, and at that stage we were too soft-hearted to shell their homes, a proceeding which might have expedited the whole advance considerably." Every little Norman village, with its high walls and narrow streets, was ideally suited for riflemen to fire on the invaders from behind cover. Each hamlet needed an hour or two for the infantry to winkle out the enemy, aided by some tanks. By early evening of the 6th, the weary KSLI felt themselves tantalizingly close to the old city of Caen, focus of every D-Day ambition of Montgomery, their army commander. Len Murray nonetheless observed that our numbers had shrunk rather alarmingly. It's a quirky footnote that 30 years later, this same Lieutenant Murray became Secretary General of the TUC. The leading company approached a wooded ridge up rising ground. Suddenly, bursts of German fire harrowed them. The company commander, an officer named Peter Steele, saw a machine gun position ahead and ran towards it, clutching his revolver. He was shot, dying nearer to Caen, just 3 miles ahead, than any other British officer on D-Day. One of his platoon commanders, Lieutenant Tom Gwilliam, nonetheless stubbornly said, "We must try to take the high ground." Gwilliam crawled further uphill until he reached a cattle trough. There he told his wireless operator to stop while he himself kept going. Within seconds, there was a new burst of fire, and the lieutenant collapsed, hit in the stomach. Almost miraculously, Gwilliam's platoon sergeant contrived to drag the officer back behind a bank. Stretcher bearers reached them, and Gwilliam survived. One of his soldiers, further back down the hill, said it was all a bit of a shambles. The colonel now decided not to attack again that night, saying, I think we've come far enough. The Shropshires, and especially their officers, had displayed notable guts and done all they could as the Germans rushed to reinforce Labisi Ridge, where the British advance on Caen stuck for almost the next fortnight. Those last hours of D-Day were marked by one more tragic accident, so typical of all war. In darkness, a Shropshire's lieutenant was sent out with a sergeant to reconnoitre no man's land. When the two men returned, the officer called out, "Don't shoot, Mr. Rees!" The jumpy defenders nonetheless opened fire, killing Di Rees and his NCO. A soldier said weary that those responsible were just trigger-happy green troops in the end. The two dead men were the last of 113 casualties that Shropshire suffered on the 6th of June. Those battles that I briefly described were typical of many, not merely on D-Day, but throughout the war, which is why I explore in detail the whys and wherefores of them in my book. A young platoon commander wrote that in Normandy, quote, "I began to appreciate how vital is grip on oneself, grip on one's soldiers, and grip on the situation. Most men react nervously to real battle conditions. Discipline and regimental pride are support, but in decisive moments of great danger, if you do not dominate events, your enemy will." As nightfall descended on Normandy, hundreds of thousands of men succumbed to awe about the magnitude of the events in which they were participating. One wrote, "Of all the other impressions of the day, by far the most pronounced at the end of it was surprise and thankfulness that we were still alive to tell the tale." One of the best-loved officers in the whole army, the East Yorkshire's Major Charles Banger King, took the trouble to write to his batman's mother. "I cannot express too deeply my admiration for the men I've been commanding. When we landed at HR, they went straight over the beaches in spite of a murderous fire, and in half an hour had cleared a gap through which poured the reserve companies, commandos, and it seemed to me about half the British Army. You've every reason to be proud of your son and the part he's played in this damn war." Of the British battalions that have been most heavily engaged, the South Lancs lost 107, the East Yorks 206, 1/3 of its fighting strength. Yet there would have been plenty of days later in what became the murderous Normandy campaign, when more British and American soldiers died than have perished on 6th of June. To the astonishment and dismay of those who permitted themselves a sigh of relief on discovering at nightfall that they were still alive, worse things lay ahead. For almost 3 months, Montgomery's forces suffered an average of 2,354 casualties. An infantry battalion lost an average of 36 officers and 809 other ranks, killed, wounded, or taken prisoners. Insofar as any event in any war can be characterized as glamorous, D-Day on the 6th of June was such an event, when Eisenhower's armies and the air and naval forces shared in a vast spectacular such as the world had never seen before and never would again. A fundamental question facing the units that landed was whether they were expected or required, either by their commanders or their country, to pour forth blood in profusion to perform great deeds beyond merely seizing a beachhead. By the standards of the 300 at Thermopylae, of Wellington squares at Waterloo, many showed themselves cautious, hesitant, fearful of loss. Some individuals, mostly officers and NCOs, displayed exemplary courage and will for sacrifice. But this didn't extend to all their men. It seems nonetheless mistaken to pass any censure. On Sword Beach and beyond, indeed, across every invasion beach on the 6th of June, there was courage enough and sacrifice enough. There was merely not the embrace of self-immolation which a battle for national survival can rightfully demand. Almost every thoughtful soldier who participated in the Normandy campaign was profoundly affected by the experience. Colonel Jim Eadie wrote home to his wife, "We must indeed, if we are spared, try to help with all we've got to end this madness of war. It's easy at times of stress and imminent danger to resolve to give one's all to ensure that such things shall never happen again. But it's easier then to slip into one's old mode of living when the crisis has passed. I won't do this. I'm resolved to use what life I have left to add to the happiness of mankind and to make good to those who suffered." These sentiments might sound to some 21st century people mawkish, but they reflect the emotions of a courageous soldier, appalled by the scenes he'd witnessed, the dead men whom he'd known. The colonel of another unit warned his men before the 6th of June, "Those first days are going to be exhausting and probably absolute hell. We must have confidence that we are going to do it better than the other side." And so they did. It's sad to end by telling you that the young commando who apologized profusely to the German soldier for shooting him on D-Day was himself killed the very next day. It's right that the descendants of himself and of all his comrades, together with our nation, should honor their memories in this 80th year since the Allies celebrated the victorious ending of the Second World War. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sir Max. I should say briefly, for those members of our audience who are watching this show at home on through the internet, you need, if you want to continue watching, you need to go to spectator.co.uk/live to watch our Q&A and audience participation afterwards. Max, thank you very much for that fascinating overview. I hope you're enjoying this discussion of Sword, D-Day, Trial by Battle. If you're still watching on YouTube, you'll need to go to spectator.co.uk/live to watch the rest of this live stream, and you must be a Spectator magazine subscriber in order to do so. If you're still not signed up, fear not. You can subscribe in seconds and get the next 3 months of the Spectator subscription for £3 only, including this talk, our other live streams, as well as unlimited access to all our articles on the app, as well as the magazine being delivered to your door. Go to spectator.co.uk/live to sign up right now for just £3 and don't miss a moment. That's it for the free preview of our Book Club live talk. However, we're still in full flow over at spectator.co.uk/live, where you can continue watching as a Spectator magazine subscriber. If you don't subscribe to the magazine, you can change that in seconds and get your first 3 months for £3 and continue watching the event. Head over to spectator.co.uk/live now. Your Spectator magazine subscription will include full access to our website and app, with daily commentary on all the talking points of the day, plus the weekly magazine every Thursday, along with a host That's it for the free preview of our book club live talk. However, we're still in full flow over at spectator.co.uk/live, where you can continue watching as a Spectator magazine subscriber. If you don't subscribe to the magazine, you can change that in seconds and get your first 3 months for £3 and continue watching the event. Head over to spectator.co.uk/live now. Your Spectator magazine subscription will include full access to our website and app, with daily commentary on all the talking points of the day, plus the weekly magazine every Thursday, along with a host of other benefits, like subscriber newsletters and, of course, our live stream broadcasts. Go to spectator.co.uk/live to sign up right now for just £3. Don't miss a moment. That's it for the free preview of our book club live talk. However, we're still in full flow over at spectator.co.uk/live, where you can continue watching as a Spectator magazine subscriber. If you don't subscribe to the magazine, you can change that in seconds and get your first 3 months for £3 and continue watching the event. Head over to spectator.co.uk/live now. Your Spectator magazine subscription will include full access to our website and app, with daily commentary on all the talking points of the day, plus the weekly magazine every Thursday, along with a host of other benefits, like subscriber newsletters and, of course, our live stream broadcasts. Go to spectator.co.uk/live to sign up right now for just £3. Don't miss a moment. I hope you're enjoying this discussion of Sword D-Day Trial by Battle. If you're still watching on YouTube, you'll need to go to spectator.co.uk/live to watch the rest of this live stream, and you must be a Spectator magazine subscriber in order to do so. If you're still not signed up, fear not. You can subscribe in seconds and get the next 3 months of Spectator subscription for £3 only, including this talk, our other live streams, as well as unlimited access to all our articles on the app, as well as the magazine being delivered to your door. Go to spectator.co.uk/live to sign up right now for just £3 and don't miss a moment. That's it for the free preview of our book club live talk. However, we're still in full flow over at spectator.co.uk/live, where you can continue watching as a Spectator magazine subscriber. If you don't subscribe to the magazine, you can change that in seconds and get your first 3 months for £3 and continue watching the event. Head over to spectator.co.uk/live now. Your Spectator magazine subscription will include full access to our website and app, with daily commentary on all the talking points of the day, plus the weekly magazine every Thursday, along with a host of other benefits, like subscriber newsletters and, of course, our live stream broadcasts. Go to spectator.co.uk/live to sign up right now for just £3. Don't miss a moment.